A quick like and subscribe really helps our channel grow and allows us to bring you even more amazing content. Thank you for your support.
I never thought the word confession would bind me to this web of truth and lies, but here I am, ready to unravel it. I suppose it all began when I was 13, a tumultuous age where imagination and reality seemed to blur into an intricate dance of fear and longing. Growing up, urban legends about our town were woven into the fabric of our existence. The most sinister of them whispered about the old Barclay house, a decrepit ruin that slouched at the town's edge like a weary old man. Countless tales wrapped it in darkness, stories of missing children and whispered curses that snagged on the breezes that sliced down Main Street. It was in this atmosphere of half-formed shadows and unspeakable dread that I first told my lie. I mentioned the Barclay house during show and tell at school, an insignificant mention that spiraled out of control. My uncle was attacked there, I said, embellishing each word with the envy only a child wishing to be noticed could conjure. A lie to garner attention, to feel, for a moment, the thrilling pity in my classmates' eyes. That evening, as I walked home beneath a swollen autumn sky, something peculiar happened. I began to genuinely fear the house and the stories spun around it. I even started dreaming about that old place, dreams where shadows peeled themselves from the walls to whisper secrets I couldn't quite catch. Oddly enough, the dreams didn't scare me, they intrigued me, as if the house itself were a living, breathing entity reaching out. I became obsessed. Up at night, unable to sleep, I'd find myself gazing out my window where only a sliver of the old Barclay's roof crest was visible, backlit by the town's dim streetlights. My life turned into a revolving door of truth and deception, reality as porous as the town's old ghost stories. I found myself feeding into my own lies, craving the taste of each fabrication's power, a power that seeped into my waking life. Strangely, my parents never contradicted my stories. Their silence seemed complicit, almost as if they, too, feared the legends, which only added layers to my tangled web. As the stories spread, I remember a stranger knocking at our door. Disguised as a harmless letter carrier, she knew everything about me, reminders of my own details now muddled by repeated illusions. Her visit was a trigger, unraveling memories like threads in a tapestry, dragging me into a past where I hugged shadows for comfort. My heart hammered erratically as she asked questions, delicate yet probing. Something about her eyes, that deep murk of old secrets and raw honesty, made me confess my concocted tales, stuttering through excuses that felt like dead leaves rustling on forgotten streets. But then something unexpected happened. A glint in her eyes, a slither of knowing that felt rooted in another plane of understanding, shifted my perception. But what if some of it was true? She whispered, leaving behind a chilling promise, a possibility. Hours later, feeling both lighter and more burdened by what I'd shared, I sat and thought. Who was she? A ghost of conscience or a purveyor of forgotten truths? The questions swirled like autumn leaves caught in an unwilling dance, a dance marked by confusion, guilt, and an odd sense of relief. I became acutely aware that the lines I blurred had become walls in my mind, protecting and hiding emotions buried deep. For days, I couldn't shake off the knowledge that the Barclay house pulled at me, as if accusing me of my fabrications, daring me to reconcile with whatever lurked there. Finally, driven by an inexplicable resolve, I decided to confront the old place. The world seemed to hush as I stood before the ominous framework of the Barclay house, its silhouette etched against the twilight sky like a scar on the town's memory. With every tentative step, reality flickered, its fragile tapestry a mockery of my earlier musings. The door, aged and unreliable as my fabricated memories, creaked open. Inside, the air felt alive, charged with stories untold and ghosts of events long past. Each creak of the floorboards, every whisper of the wind through cracked windows, seemed to murmur truths all their own. My mind raced with visions, fragments of potential truths born from my own fabrications. As I reached the heart of the house, that old dining room where raindrops played forlorn symphonies on the shattered windows, I realized I was no longer afraid of what had happened to my imaginary uncle. Instead, I felt an overwhelming connection to something I couldn't quite name. As shadows climbed the walls, I heard them, those whispers from my dreams, clearer now, unraveling the knots in my mind. They didn't voice horror or dread, rather a soothing tale, a tale of acceptance, where fiction no longer enticed me to distort my past. The lie I'd spun no longer held me, it released me. As I left the old Barclay house behind, stepping into the chill embrace of night with a heart unburdened, I knew the truth at last, the shadows were mine, and in confronting them, I found not horror but a hesitant peace, knowing that somewhere in the web of truth and lies, I had discovered myself. I never expected to encounter something unimaginable at the yoga studio, a place of peace and tranquility for most of us. The Tuesday evening class was always packed, filled with people looking to unwind after a long day. As the instructor, it was my duty to ensure everyone was comfortable and had enough space to practice without disturbance. That's why it caught my attention when an unfamiliar woman walked in, eyes scanning for a spot. I noticed she paused when she saw an empty mat space in the back corner, an area many avoided, not due to lack of space, but because of an eerie incident a few months back. A regular student, Alex, passed away suddenly during a session, and it left an unsettling vibe in that particular spot. Most of the class still whispered about it, convinced that Alex never truly left us. When the newcomer laid her mat down in that space, a chill rushed down my spine. I never felt anything supernatural, just an odd tension in that spot, a sense of heaviness in the air. As I began class, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. My mind told me to ask her to move, a whisper of paranoia, perhaps, or a genuine gut feeling. But then again, what would I say? "Excuse me, could you move because some people think this place is haunted?" Would surely make me seem ridiculous, and perhaps she was someone who didn't believe in such things. Determined to focus, I initiated the session. The usual rhythm of focused breathing and gentle stretching commenced, but my attention kept drifting back to her. She seemed offbeat, as if she wasn't entirely present, or maybe she merely had her own sequence. My concern for disturbing the class balance warred with my curiosity, and a strange anxiety continued to brim beneath my professional demeanor. Soon, as we transitioned into more complex poses, the lights began flickering, throwing unsettling shadows along the walls. I heard gasps, students faltering mid-pose as the strobes of light created an uncanny, almost ethereal atmosphere, casting warped versions of us along the reflective studio mirrors. Then came the whispers, echoing quietly at first, rising like an imperceptible background frequency, words I couldn't distinguish. Everyone else seemed focused, unfazed, their faces serene masks, but when I glanced back at her, the new woman seemed transfixed, staring fixedly at her own reflection, as if in a trance. I knew I should end it there, break the spell of unease that tightened around us, but it was as though words lodged in my throat, paralyzed. Time warped into an infinite stretch, and within that warped instant, I saw her reflection change. It shifted subtly, facial features morphing, the eye sockets deepening, cheekbones growing sharper. It looked like Alex. Involuntarily, I took a step back, feeling a palpable force radiate from her, a gravitational pull of fear that clamped down on my heart. When she finally turned toward me, still in her spot, the flickering lights ceased, leaving only the dim ambience of the evening studio. The atmosphere felt lighter, as if waking from a shared nightmare, and the class continued, albeit with a muted tension. As I closed the session, hesitant eyes hovered over me, waiting for my explanation or perhaps seeking reassurance that everything was fine, yet I offered none. The woman approached me, smile benign but eyes knowing, as if she had discovered an unspoken secret. "Thank you for the class," she said softly, walking past. In that fleeting moment, a cold breeze entered the studio, rustling the mats, a reminder, perhaps, that some boundaries should not be displaced, that some spaces were meant to be left undisturbed. But the haunting question, one I dared not voice aloud, lingered: had Alex truly returned, or had I become a lingering specter of my own irrational fears? When I reached for my phone later, I instinctively typed a message intended for no one in particular, seeking absolution for letting a mystery remain unsolved in the shadowy folds of our everyday sanity, a myth AITA for not forcing this yoga student into a different mat spot. And as my fingers hesitated over the post button, a curious feeling, a knowing chill in the normally warm studio, suggested that sometimes, the mysteries we choose to leave untouched are the ones that silently watch us, waiting, from mirrors or the dim corners of our own reflections. A myth asshole for telling my sister no to taking in her kids? It seems like a simple question, and maybe at first glance, I am the asshole. But once you hear what happened, maybe you'll understand. It was just after midnight when the first call came through. My sister Clara was hysterical, barely coherent, her voice nothing but a trembling whisper mingling with the static and crackle of a poor connection. They came back, she managed to choke out before the line abruptly went dead. My heart pounded like a tribal drum in my chest, questions swirling in my mind like a swarm of angry wasps. Only a week ago, Clara had confessed about the ominous visits she'd been receiving, things she couldn't explain and that defied reason, a feeling of being watched, shadows creeping along walls, doors opening in the dead of night. I brushed it off as stress. She was now a single mother of two energetic boys after the tragic and sudden passing of her husband, Kevin, in a supposed hit-and-run accident. She'd become paranoid, understandable given her circumstances. But when the house phone rattled against its cradle and her line went silent once more, I grabbed my car keys and headed to her house, the dark highway unfolding like a predatory beast under my headlights. The house was eerily still when I arrived, an unsettling air that made the hair on the back of my neck stand upright. I pushed the front door open, and an oppressive silence flooded over me. Clara's home, once filled with laughter and the exuberance of young children, now felt hollow, like a tomb. "Clara?" I called out, my voice echoing into the void. A shiver ran down my spine as I moved deeper into the house. The hallway light flickered nervously as I approached the living room, and there I found him, Clara huddled in a corner, clutching her children, her eyes wide and glistening like those of a hunted animal. She looked up at me, desperation etched deep into her features, stammering for me to understand the severity of what was happening. "They're everywhere," she whispered, her voice barely audible above the thudding of my heart. "Watching, lurking. Always waiting." Any lingering skepticism I held evaporated. There was a tangible darkness in the house, a malevolent presence that seemed to throb with its own energy. I wanted to comfort her, to tell her everything would be okay, but the truth caught in my throat. I'd felt it too, the oppressive gaze from the shadows, like multitudes of eyes, each pinning us in place. Then, a dull, resonant thrumming shook the house, emanating from the very floors beneath us. The windows rattled in their frames as I felt an involuntary chill climb my spine. Clara's children whimpered, clutching their mother tighter, their small bodies trembling with fear. "Please, take them," she pleaded, desperation clinging to her words. She pointed to a suitcase she'd packed, as if expecting me to whisk her sons away, to give them a refuge from whatever terror plagued her home. But something primal screamed at me not to take a step further. It was a strange, uncanny sensation, a voice, their voice perhaps, reverberating within my skull. An incoherent whisper, promising no, demanding that they stay. My legs felt like lead as Clara begged me once more, tears streaming down her face, her body racked with sobs. And it was the boys I looked at then, really looked into their eyes. For the briefest moment, their pupils seemed to shift, like shadows darting through their gaze before it vanished into normalcy. Yet, that slip was enough to root me in place, a cold realization prickling along my skin. I knew then, without a shadow of a doubt, they weren't safe, but neither was I or anyone else. The darkness had marked them, claimed their fragile, innocent lives as an entry into our world. I staggered back, my heart pounding in my ears, the air around me growing thicker, weightier. I felt it would swallow me whole if I allowed it. Rational thought was unspooling fast, and the urge to flee was overwhelming. I backed away slowly, hearing Clara's voice following me, rising in panic, her pleas twisting into accusations. I should have carried those boys to safety, taken them away, but something prevented me as if invisible hands held me in check. The air shivered, growing dense with a presence I couldn't deny. It hung between us, a choice, a barrier, a warning. The moment I crossed the threshold with those children would mark my fate and theirs as inextricably bound to whatever watched from the darkened corners. I left the house, staggered into the night, every instinct urging me to bold, to drive as fast and as far from them as I could. Clara's cries echoed in my mind as I stumbled back to my car, feeling the weight of guilt and fear pressing down on me like a vice as the darkness swallowed me whole. I considered reaching out, telling someone, but who would believe me? Perhaps this was her reality now, or mine if I let it. Silent whispers still echo in my dreams, pulling me back to those nightmarish moments. I find myself questioning the boundaries of reality, teetering on the edge of an unsettling truth. Was I the asshole for leaving them there, or would taking them have unleashed something far worse? Late at night, long after the town has sunk into a mournful quiet, I still hear Clara's desolate voice, calling out from the dark, her words a chilling refrain that never fades. For the past 12 years, I haven't been who you think I am, and the weight of deception is beginning to crush me. It started innocently enough back in college, when an unassuming job offer arrived one snowy afternoon, nestled between bills and junk mail. It was from a company claiming to be a groundbreaking startup, promising an opportunity that as a struggling sophomore, seemed like a godsend. All I had to do was assume a different identity. They never gave details, but the lure of financial stability blinded my judgment. I was to become Patrick Holloway, a name that almost sounded like it belonged to someone who lived by the rules, but little did I know, it was more like stepping into a vacant grave. They trained me to meld seamlessly into the skin of this persona, drilling my past, present, and future until there was no daylight between my identity and Patrick's. But Patrick had baggage, a shadow I could feel thicken behind me like fog. At first, It was just short gigs, attending events posing as this distinguished character, collecting CVs of the unsuspecting in tech circles. It was peculiar, sure, but harmless, or so I thought. The money was real, and the non-existent background of Patrick was filled with expert-crafted lies. Over time, however, the jobs became darker, involving sabotage and planting software that skimmed data from powerful companies. I was in too deep to say no. And this is where I should have stopped it all, stepped out of the ill-fitting shoes of Patrick, and confessed, but by then, I was addicted to the adventure, the semblance of power that came with being someone I wasn't. I thought I could maintain control, but my puppeteers were far more skillful. As the years passed, bonds formed around me, friendships and even a love interest named Zoe, none of which I deserved because they were based on nothing but threads of deception. I never told her the true essence of my existence, how could I? She loved the idea of Patrick, an irony-laden truth I had to swallow every day. But as I said, there's more. Recently, I started noticing that I wasn't the only Patrick Holloway. From subtle hints in emails and face-to-face encounters, I discerned there were others, different lives being run simultaneously by disposable men like myself. The Patrick-based network was vaster than I could comprehend. Every time another man failed or was discovered, he vanished without a trace, vaporized before the world knew what happened, and my fear grew as reality settled into clarity. I wasn't a unique deception but part of an industrial operation, a syndicate making use of Patrick and his ghostly brothers like living chess pieces. I tried to extract myself, but every door was sealed, leading me back into a mapped existence. The final straw came when Zoe, tired of my evasiveness, demanded to learn about my childhood. I could feel my fabricated world unraveling, brittle lines snapping under scrutiny. I had nothing of substance to give but cold fiction crafted in haste all those years ago. Before I could even consider it out, the company once again approached me, directly, men in suits who seemed to know more about my real life than I remembered myself. They told me I would be the last Patrick, the endgame moving toward culmination. I felt the noose tighten as they revealed just enough of their machinations to keep me on a precise tightrope, promising safety yet offering nothing verifiable. The final mission they orchestrated was catastrophic, a breach was inevitable, an implosion they intended to blame on me to cover all traces. With only threads connecting me to the other Patricks, I knew the others were being dismissed neatly, permanently. I realized then that my only choice was to confess, tell the fragmented world behind the screen of my shadow, and cling to the hope someone, anyone, would believe me. So, here I am, shedding the layers one confession at a time, carving an exit from an identity that isn't mine, knowing they're likely watching. The truth is, those 12 years, those acquaintances, and love not meant for me, have all built to this final plea: believe the lie was never the beginning, but merely a middle, a prelude to something more ominous and intrinsically terrifying that lays unseen, waiting for its next one. Each keystroke feels like it might be the last one. I have long dropped the illusion of safety. This was never just my confession, consider it a warning. They're still out there, crafting new Patricks, or worse. Next time you meet someone and their story doesn't quite add up, look deeper. What rests beneath might not merely be a person, but a construct of their own unmaking. When my therapist, Dr. Hendricks, suggested the experimental therapy session, he regarded it like magic, sprinkling my life with transformative stardust that only a few privileged souls got to experience. The air in his office hung with a thick, lingering anticipation crammed with books wearing the dust of forgotten centuries. Dr. Hendricks, an eccentric blend of sharp eyes and warm demeanor, leaned forward and said, "This will change your life, Claire." My heart, hopeful and reckless, danced at the promise. He called it subconscious immersion therapy, and I was the perfect candidate, a young, resilient mind tormented by the echoing unrest of an untraceable anxiety. The concept was deceptively simple. I would plunge into a guided journey inside my subconscious, mining the depths of my psyche to confront and understand the fears that tethered me to sleepless nights. Within the safe boundaries defined by Dr. Hendricks, my consciousness would be expanded and narrowed all at once, peeling back the layers of my mind like an onion, until the pungent core was finally revealed. The session began with me lying on a plush chaise, listening to the rhythmic, dulcet tones of a metronome as a strange device was placed on my head, connecting me to the computers that hummed a low, comforting lullaby. "You're going to feel a slight tingling sensation," Dr. Hendricks explained as his words swirled around me like leaves caught in a gentle autumn breeze. I nodded, feeling a prickling warmth bleed through my veins, each pulse a promise of transcendental revelations. As my eyelids fluttered shut, the world receded, leaving behind the shadow of the metronome's resolute ticks. That's when I became aware of the darkness, a profound, all-encompassing void that was both a blank slate and a canvas waiting to be tainted by buried memories. Instead of fear, a deep and curious respite cradled my consciousness, urging me to explore further. Suddenly, I was standing in my childhood bedroom, the walls still painted with wildflowers my mother had lovingly stenciled in my youthful days. Moonlight danced through the sheer curtains, casting intricate patterns on the hardwood floor. Everything was eerily untouched by time, except for the photograph by my bedside, one that was never actually there. My hands trembling, I picked it up, revealing an image of a family dinner. Except it wasn't from my memories, I'd never seen these people before. They laughed, their joy infectious in a memory that wasn't mine to begin with. The sensation of unease intensified, like a spider crawling up my spine. But the room, as if alive and sentient, urged me forward, inhaling and exhaling with a life of its own. Distant whispers echoed in the hallway, compelling me to step through the door. My feet, leaden yet determined, carried me towards the voices that slithered through the walls, a chorus of people trapped in the folds of my subconscious. I found myself in a grandiose dining room, a mishmash of periods, clashing from ancient to modern, a kaleidoscope of time lost and forgotten. At the table sat figures with faces blurred as though out of focus in a dream. It was terrifyingly familiar, like trying to recall a nightmare upon waking. The figures engaged in a symphony of garbled conversations, their voices rising and falling in chaotic crescendos around me. Among them was a mirror, old and cracked, reflecting not my face but a tapestry of emotions, rage, despair, love, all flickering in flashes like distant lightning. In that instant, the room shuddered, the illusion faltered, unraveling the threads of my fateful tapestry. Faces of the people in the photographs started forming clearer images, and one by one, they turned towards me, their eyes lifeless yet piercing as if questioning my presence. Panic carved its way into my chest, but curiosity, relentless and seductive, urged me on. I stumbled backward, my fingers entwining in the web of lies my own mind had woven. With a blink, the scene dissolved, leaving me amidst a swirling mist, a timeless wasteland devoid of life. Here, a solitary figure waited, an elderly woman with eyes that matched mine, ageless pearls in a cavernous ocean of shadows. She sang a lullaby in a language I knew but couldn't place, resonating through my being until it unlocked memories I didn't know I had hidden. Glimpses of another life flashed before me, glories and mistakes woven into the tapestry I had partially unraveled. Before I could grasp the totality of this revelation, her voice penetrated my consciousness, a whisper that shook the core of my reality. Never forget that you are the architect of your existence, and what you bury will always find its way back to light. Suddenly, the room fell silent, the world frozen in its tracks as I gasped, my soul trembling on the precipice between discovery and despair. With a jerk, I awoke on the chaise in Dr. Hendrix's office, drenched in sweat and heart pounding like war drums. His eyes studied me intently, satisfaction, a veneer masking something far deeper, etched into his gaunt features. "You've seen it, haven't you? You've uncovered the truth," he stated in knowing calmness that unsettled me. But as I reached for words, I found my voice caged by the echoes of the mirror's emotions still reverberating within. In the days that followed, my perspective shifted, as did the world around me. Colors, brighter and more vibrant than ever, mocked my blind ignorance. Memories resurfaced unbidden, piecing together fragments of forgotten lives with mine as the centerpiece. Relationships crumbled under the weight of sudden, inexplicable knowledge I couldn't share without unraveling the very fabric of my existence. My connection with reality twisted like threads caught in a gale, each revelation shaping and reshaping who I thought I was. And Dr. Hendrix, always present in the shadow of my newfound awareness, kept warning me that the journey had only begun, that I must embrace or refute the riddled identity my subconscious had revealed. No longer anchored to the ordinary, I've been restlessly exploring the boundaries of my life, a dichotomy of light and shadow guiding my path. What I apprehended in that experimental therapy has unfurled an enigmatic labyrinth I am both terrified and compelled to navigate. Every night, I dip into dreams that fracture the line between reality and illusion, knowing that monstrous truths lie coiled in the heart of my existence, ready to ensnare me in their unforeseen embrace. This therapy dislodged more than I could have fathomed, it awoke a relentless metamorphosis, and I am forever altered, living on borrowed breaths among strangers I once called my own. I'm not one to post my life's mistakes on social media, but I have to get this off my chest, and I hope someone out there can understand or at least provide me some kind of absolution. About a month ago, life was normal. An average job, an average apartment, and well, an average life. But that all changed when I ran into my old college roommate, Joshua. We hadn't seen each other in years, merely exchanged the obligatory likes and comments on each other's online posts. Anyway, catching up over drinks turned into a constant hangout phase. Reminiscing about old times made the mundane seem vibrant again. It was during one of those nights when Josh, visibly edgy and a bit too eager, introduced me to the game. It wasn't like any game I'd ever played before. It didn't have boards or dice, but it started with a plain manila envelope containing an address inside. "The rules are simple," Josh said, eyes gleaming. "Deliver the envelope, and you get your prize." At first, I refused. It sounded like some twisted scavenger hunt, but curiosity and a little alcohol nudged me towards accepting his dare. I thought he was just messing with me. But when I opened the envelope, the address was unsettlingly close to where I lived. That night, with more than a few beers fortifying my courage, I walked over, like some late-night adventurer in my own urban tale. The place was dark, an old dilapidated house that looked like it hadn't seen life in ages. As instructed, I slipped the envelope through the mail slot and seconds later, my phone pinged with a notification of a deposit, $500. It felt surreal, confounding even, and my heart raced with a weird mixture of fear and exhilaration. I told myself it would be a one-time thing. But days passed, and that notification stared back at me, the money somehow whispering promises of easy success. Another week went by, and I became fixated on the contact saved in my phone simply as Game Master. Testing the waters, I messaged them, asking if there were more envelopes to deliver. Within minutes, I received a new address and a promise of a higher reward. Things snowballed from there. I'd drop off a package, always to these abandoned, haunting locations, and watch as my bank balance blossomed. It wasn't until the fourth delivery that something felt truly off. This address was way out in the woods, a place Google Maps struggled to pinpoint. I should have stopped then. Everything screamed at me to walk away, but dizzy from naivete or greed, I didn't listen. I followed the directions into what I was certain was the set of some horror movie, where trees felt like spectators and shadows twisted into memories of nightmares long forgotten. I was instructed to leave the package by a particular tree marked with a red ribbon. Sweat poured down my face in the chilling air, but the job was done quickly, and I returned home, heart still thudding loudly enough to echo in the silence of my sanctuary. But then things began changing. I noticed shadows in my apartment that flickered like wandering ghosts, and objects would be where I hadn't left them, tiny incremental shifts designed to drive anyone mad. At night, when sleep finally claimed me, vivid nightmares plagued my mind, dreams of empty eyes watching me through the slits of abandoned buildings and whispered threats in languages I couldn't understand. Worse, I started seeing someone, or something, out of the corner of my eye, just a tall, dark figure cloaked in obscurity, and every time I turned, it vanished, leaving only traces of an overwhelming dread. Part of me wanted to confront Josh, hear answers from him if I had to, but he disappeared from town without a trace, no phone calls, no status updates, as if he never existed at all. Meanwhile, my paranoia flared into anxiety, and common sounds around me could turn harmless days into haunted nights. Desperate for clarity, I reached out one last time to the Game Master, begging for an understanding, a reason for these mind-numbing experiences. What I received wasn't a reply, but another envelope under my door, a mirror to my first task but somehow much heavier with an unnameable menace. Inside was a picture, a photograph of my very own apartment building. This time there were no instructions, only a knowing threat sealed with the absence of words. Real fear gripped me then, every facade of self-assurance crumbled, as though life's script was rewritten by some unseen hand. So, I did the only thing I thought might end this, left the city, packed what I could carry and drove across state lines to a place where there are no envelopes, no strange games with rules veiled by darkness. I don't know how far I've driven, or for how long, but with every mile, the bizarre heaviness surrounding me feels diluted. Still, I'm haunted by the feeling that eyes remain fixed, watching, waiting, perhaps even judging. As I pen this, hidden in the imprecision of anonymity, I realize my past decisions unshackled forces that I may never escape. This isn't a confession meant to purge guilt, nor a means to warn others of the unknown lurking in seemingly innocent challenges. Rather, this is a scream into the void, a kaleidoscope of pixels and words, hoping that when you read this, somewhere far beyond where I have traveled, a part of my heavy truth reaches through the reflective glow of your screen, touching the wisdom in your core. If you ever find yourself tempted to play a game without rules, to walk the blurred lines between curiosity and destruction, I urge you to reconsider. My story twists in the churned depths of something old and malevolent, It's a tale which stalks my movements, turning peace into a fractured silence I have come to embody but have yet to fully comprehend. It all started when my brother Kevin invited his girlfriend, Sarah, to stay with us for the weekend. I already had reservations about her. She always seemed too perfect, like she was hiding something beneath her meticulously managed facade. But Kevin was smitten, so I held my tongue. On the first night, Sarah offered to cook dinner. As she moved around the kitchen, everything seemed normal, but there was something off about her demeanor, a subtle tension in her voice. After dinner, she volunteered to clean up, insisting everyone else relax. An hour later, I wandered into the kitchen to grab a drink and found her speaking urgently into her phone, barely whispering. She stopped abruptly when she noticed me, flushing visibly before shifting into a clumsy small talk about dessert options. Nothing major, but my instincts were tingling. The following day, Kevin suggested a hike up the nearby trail. Sarah declined, citing a sudden headache, encouraging us to go ahead without her. Reluctant to leave a guest home alone, I decided to stay behind, claiming I needed to catch up on some work. I confess it was partly an excuse to observe her more closely, without intruding, just to satisfy my own cautious nature. An hour after the others left, I heard movement from the bathroom, then the distinct sound of the front door opening and closing quietly a few minutes later. Curiosity piqued, I peered out the window, seeing Sarah heading briskly toward the edge of our property, the direction leading to nothing but dense woods. It didn't sit right with me. I slipped on my shoes and grabbed my jacket, determined to find out what she was up to. Keeping a safe distance, I watched her disappear into the trees, my interest now morphed into concern. Was she meeting someone else? I trailed her cautiously, the crunch of leaves underfoot echoing ominously in the brisk air. In the depths of the woods, she finally stopped in a clearing where a small cabin stood isolated and worn down, something out of a horror movie set. She approached the cabin, knocked hesitantly on its weather-beaten door, and stepped inside without waiting for a response. I crept closer, heart pounding in my chest like a tribal drum as curiosity fought with a rising dread. Pressing my ear against the wooden wall, I could barely make out Sarah's voice through the dilapidated structure. It carried a kind of fervency I hadn't heard from her before. There was another voice too, deeper and definitely male, though I couldn't catch much of what was being said. Snippets of a heated conversation floated to me, words tinged with urgency and fear, phrases like "they can't find out," and "not stable" sent my imagination spiraling into dark possibilities. Who was she talking to? My mind raced over potential scenarios, each more twisted than the last. The dialogue suddenly became louder, crescendoing to a point where I picked up enough to understand that Sarah was involved in something dangerous. Something about a job gone wrong, someone being hidden. As she vehemently argued, I realized they were discussing Kevin. She was using him, deceiving him. My stomach turned with anger and disbelief. But before I could puzzle further, the conversation stopped abruptly. The cabin door swung open, and Sarah stormed out, her expression a volatile mix of fury and fear. I pressed back into the shadows, holding my breath as she paced blindly past me, her eyes unfocused and brimming with tears, murmuring something under her breath that sounded like a vow. Once she was gone, the cabin's occupant emerged, a rugged man with a sinister air around him, scanning the surroundings as though sensing a presence, or perhaps just wary of being followed. I remained hidden, anxiety bubbling within as he lit a cigarette and retreated back inside. As silence reclaimed the woods, I knew I had to return, but I couldn't shake the dark chill that now clung to me like a second skin. Back in the house, Sarah seemed composed, her headache miraculously vanished, engaging Kevin with tales of her day spent binge-watching a new series. I sat quietly, my mind in turmoil, wondering when and how I should break what I discovered. As night descended, I checked the front door twice, suspiciously vigilant, and barricaded myself in my room. Sleep eluded me, replaying her words, the cabin, the man, over and over until dawn. In the morning, I decided to confront her, cornering her while Kevin showered, but she preempted me with a shocking calmness. "I know what you think you saw," she began, her voice low and measured, "but there are things you can understand, things better left alone." Her eyes bore into mine with an unsettling clarity that chilled me to the core. I realized then she wouldn't just let me turn my back on her secrets, she had already calculated the risks and maneuvered closer into our lives. Her tone shifted, now almost pleading as she spun a tale of necessity and blackmail, painting herself a reluctant participant in whatever malevolent drama the cabin housed. "You can't say anything," she implored, "for Kevin's sake." The grip of uncertainty tightened around my resolve. I knew Sarah was far from innocent, but now it seemed that punishing her would also ripple into my brother's life, dragging him into chaos. Retreating back to my room, I mulled over what to do, doubt gnawing like a relentless parasite. And that's how I find myself here, tossing my story into the void of the internet, seeking advice from nameless strangers, haunted by the question, am I the asshole for walking the tightrope of family loyalty and moral duty, knowing that whatever step I take will unravel a tapestry of lies, or let my brother sink further into deception? Last year, during a road trip to clear my mind after a rough breakup, I found myself driving through a sparsely populated area of western Tennessee. It was late afternoon, and as I sped past miles of empty fields and dense forest, a flickering neon sign caught my attention, Mildred's Diner. I was famished and grateful for its existence, though something about the place felt slightly off. It sat at a crossroads, as if trapped between time, with a faded silver facade that mirrored the setting sun. There were no other cars outside, but the open 24 hours sign glowed with a welcoming promise of comfort food. My first step inside was odd. The air felt curiously dense, thick with the smell of fried food and apple pie, and the floorboards groaned beneath my feet. The interior was like walking into a postcard from the 1950s, the kind so preserved you'd think it was artificial. An elderly waitress, whose name tag read Doris, loomed behind the counter, her expression caught between a forced grin and a boredom etched over decades of serving strangers. I hesitated, but hunger outweighed my apprehension. As soon as I sat in one of the booths, Doris shuffled over with a menu. Her voice was a rasping whisper, almost drowned out by the buzzing of an old jukebox in the corner playing some forgotten rock and roll tune. I ordered a cheeseburger and a vanilla malt, feeling cliché succumbing to what was probably their signature dish. As she retreated to the kitchen, I scanned the room, noticing the absence of any other patrons despite the plethora of empty tables. Just then, the light flickered, and for a split second, I thought I saw a shadowy figure standing by the door. But when I blinked, it was gone, leaving me unsure if it had ever been there. Nervously, I convinced myself it was a trick of the light or my fatigued mind. While waiting, I glanced around at the photographs on the walls, snapshots of seemingly happy people enjoying meals, but with an eerie similarity, their smiles, upon closer inspection, looked more like grimaces. I felt an odd chill and brushed it off as my imagination. The food arrived quicker than expected. Doris placed the burger and malt in front of me with that same unsettling half-smile. The smell was incredible, enough to push aside my misgivings. The first bite was heavenly, the beef was juicy, the bun perfectly toasted, decadence on a plate. But as soon as I swallowed, an odd sensation unfurled in my stomach. It churned aggressively, a boiling anger threatening to rise into my throat. I tried to mask my discomfort, not wanting to show weakness in front of the watchful gaze of Doris, who hadn't moved from the counter, her eyes piercing. By now, the daylight outside had completely faded, and only the harsh fluorescent bulbs above battled the encroaching darkness. On instinct, I took another bite, the act mechanical, like my body demanded it despite the growing nausea. Then it happened. The room blurred for a moment, like a camera. Refocusing, and I noticed the previously absent patrons, each sitting at different booths, silent and staring directly at me. My heart kicked like a trapped rabbit, but my body refused to move. Their faces were unnaturally pale, eyes hollow, as if they'd been drained of life. I blinked again in disbelief, they vanished, leaving behind only unease. Panic licked at the edges of my consciousness. I stood abruptly, knocking over the malt which spilled across the table like melting ice cream guts. Doris, still standing, didn't react, but her eyes flicked slightly toward the plate. "Takeaway?" she suggested coolly, her voice now inexplicably resonant in the enclosed space. I declined clumsily, tossing a crumpled bill from my pocket on the table and stumbling toward the exit. Outside, the air was cool, but no less oppressive. The diner seemed to emanate a lingering heaviness. With every step towards my car, the sensation of being watched grew louder, pulsing in my temples. Once inside, I drove off hastily, eager to leave whatever madness haunted that crossroads. Minutes down the road, an involuntary glance in the rearview mirror revealed the diner illuminated not by the billboard's harsh lights but a pale, spectral glow. I shivered, speeding away, dignifying it with no second looks, chasing the notion that in distance I'd find safety. Several hours later, well past midnight, in my motel room, it began. A terrible pain shot through my abdomen, the kind that demands attention, bending me double. The terror of that moment eclipsed logical thought. Morning brought slight relief but unveiled a ghastly discovery. My reflection in the small bathroom mirror was foreign. My complexion had drained to that same unearthly pallor seen in those ethereal patrons. Memories of them flashed in my mind, and panic scratched under my skin, Relentless. Desperate, I searched online for any clue, any mention of Mildred's diner. There were no listings, reviews, or even anecdotal evidence of its existence. It was as if it vanished from reality, leaving only the lingering dread that stalked me since. I wish I had never eaten at that diner, never stopped, never succumbed to the gnawing hunger. But some choices, once made, cling to you, altering fate irreversibly. Now, each night, I see them in my dreams, the spectral diners, their mournful eyes staring, waiting, and every morning my reflection fades a little more. I fear soon, I'll become one of them, another ghostly diner, eternally hungry, forever trapped in a place that doesn't exist, haunting unsuspecting travelers who will wish they had never eaten at that diner. I've never felt the need to share this until now, but seeing how things have spiraled for some young people out there, I believe my confession can serve as a warning, especially for those stepping into the shoes of responsibility that come with looking after siblings. My name is irrelevant. You can call me an elder sister, as that's the role I grew into far too young. I suppose this all started on a mundane autumn evening when the sky was thick with clouds, and the wind howled like a pack of wolves on the hunt. My parents had left me in charge of my little brother, Sam, who was only 6 at the time. They went to visit my aunt who suddenly fell ill, leaving me with strict instructions: under no circumstances were we to leave the house. Quite simple, right? But there's nothing simple about being home alone with a child who has an affinity for adventures. At first, everything went as expected. Cartoon channels and chocolate chip cookies kept him busy while I basked in the electric glow of my phone, scrolling through trivial memes. Things began to change when the power flickered and died, plunging us into an abyss of blackness. I tried to stay calm, fetching the flashlight my dad kept in the closet. Sam was restless, clinging to my leg, his small face scrunched up in fear. I don't know what possessed me to entertain his wishes, but when he insisted we play hide and seek, I acquiesced, thinking it was a game that would put his mind at ease, and perhaps my own. I counted to 20 as I heard his small footsteps padding away into the echoing rooms of our 2-story house. I should have considered the creaks and groans that the house emitted, sounds that seemed to resonate from its very bones. Frankly, I don't know how long I spent searching each familiar space that suddenly felt foreign in the dark. There was a pervasive silence, interrupted only by the occasional creak of the floorboards. Opening the closet, checking behind curtains, under beds, he was nowhere to be found. A cold stab of anxiety set in as I navigated the dim hallways, calling out his name, my voice barely masking the brewing panic. All the while, I couldn't shake the peculiar sensation that we weren't alone, that there was a presence, a shadow, lurking just beyond my periphery. In the end, this sensation led me to the attic, a dusty, forgotten place where light barely fought its way through the grime-smeared windows. There, in the corner, was Sam, huddled and whispering to someone, or something, that I could not see. I wanted to believe it was just a child's imagination, until he turned, and his eyes weren't his own. They were deeper, darker, unfathomably so, like staring into the void. Before I could react, he spoke in a voice that certainly wasn't that of a 6-year-old. It was guttural, ancient, a language beyond comprehension that made the hair on the back of my neck stand on edge. I managed to drag him away, his body cold and limp as though he were in a trance. The flashlight flickered, casting long shadows that danced across the wooden attic beams, and for a moment, I swear I saw another form lingering there, watching, almost smirking at my feeble attempt to reclaim my brother. We stumbled and half fell down the stairs, the image permanently etched into my mind. Sam regained consciousness, or whatever semblance of it you can call, yet he was changed somehow. He didn't remember the attic or who he had spoken to. There was a blankness, a vacancy, as if something had been taken from him. The power returned with a buzz, slowly bringing life back to the house, but that evening dimmed something in us both, a hard-to-describe shadow of its own. Even after my parents came back, bustling with apologies for leaving us alone with no backup generator, I couldn't shake the aura of dread that lingered far too long after they were asleep. Sam seemed normal again, if not a little quieter than usual, yet sometimes I would catch him staring at shadows as if they whispered secrets meant only for him. Now my confession, I never told my parents. Maybe it was because I couldn't bear the disbelief or the possibility of ridicule, but perhaps because I feared that acknowledging it would make it real, too real. Sometimes I feel it was a cowardly choice, yet my burden to bear. I grew up, as siblings do, yet the watchful feeling never left me. As Sam became a teenager, the shadow clung to him like a second skin. He withdrew from friends, spent hours alone in his room with simply the company of whispers, though I never had the courage to ask whom he conversed with. Writing this, I wish I could say it was all behind us, that the ominous feeling evaporated with the cracking of dawn like morning mist. But I suspect that whatever it was, it still watches. I've seen its faint reflection in mirrors, the flicker in unattended corners of the room. My advice to anyone in my shoes? Always be vigilant. One moment of distraction in the vast silence of an empty house might seem innocent enough, but you could be opening a door to something that you can neither comprehend nor confront. Now, under the glow of the solitary lamp, as I hear shuffling in the attic above, like a whisper of the past calling, I wonder if maybe I need to confess to someone who could truly understand the gravity. But for now, these words are for you, dear reader, as the night stretches on. Would telling someone else lift this weight? Or would it only manifest it into something waiting, poised on the edge of your shadow, to follow you, wherever you may hide? It started like any other bitterly cold January morning in North Dakota, the kind where the air feels like knives on your skin and the world is blanketed in a heavy, eerie silence. I awoke to the familiar realization that the overnight snow had only thickened, obscuring my driveway under a fresh, fluffy layer. Still half dazed from the remnants of a sleep that had been mostly fleeing nightmares, I stumbled out of bed, tugging on a sweater over my pajamas and slipping my feet into boots that sat lazily by the door. Our secluded cabin was far enough from the main road that if we didn't clear our path by sunrise, we risked being snowed in completely. My wife, Sarah, had been insisting we get a snowblower, like normal people, but I had always dismissed it. After all, in the quiet and chill of morning, the shoveling felt almost meditative, even cathartic. I grabbed the shovel from the precariously leaning stack of firewood outside, the only sounds in the crisp air the crunch of my boots and the occasional yawn of the wind through the trees. To be fair, I hadn't thought twice about the fact that I was out there in my pajamas. It's not like there was anyone around to see me anyway. As I started clearing the driveway, I couldn't shake the feeling of eyes on me, as if from the surrounding forest depths lay a presence both ancient and unsettling. I brushed it off as paranoia, a side effect of those dreadful recurring dreams, but the sense of being watched grew stronger by the second. I doubled my pace, shoveling with new urgency as tendrils of unease slithered down my spine. And that's when I saw it. Dark, humanoid shapes flickering in the periphery where the morning shadows stretched long and thin, their outlines shimmering as if on the edge of my comprehension. I froze, my breath catching in a plume of frost. They lingered at the edge of the tree line, just far enough to avoid distinguishing them as either human or something distinctly other. My heart pounded in my chest like a tribal drum summoning some primordial deity. I spun around wildly, searching for signs that my mind was merely playing tricks. Get a grip, I muttered to myself, though the crude words faltered as I noticed the dents in the fresh snow, perfect, circular indentations that formed a path from the forest towards the cabin's back door. Each step matched the footprints I'd seen in nightmares where the sounds of broken whispers had beckoned from the shadows. A realization swept through me, these weren't just figments of some fever dream. These were real. Involuntarily, the shovel slipped from my shaking hands, its clatter muted by the snow's embrace. Panic surged. I had to wake up Sarah, tell her about the intruders lurking at our doorstep. As I turned toward the house, the shadows converged into focus, a cloaked figure, dark and immense, blocking my retreat. It loomed impossibly, eyes, or what I assumed to be eyes, glowing with a lightless incandescence. My body refused to move, frozen in place as if the sheer weight of my terror pinned me to the spot. Suddenly, the whispering began, not one voice but a chorus, echoing from everywhere and nowhere, the language incomprehensible but stabbing through my bones with its suffocating intensity. The entity raised an appendage, a hand, and as it did, the whispers coiled into an intelligible command piercing through the noise. Why is the child not ready? I was swept under a wave of cold understanding. Somehow, they needed my child or someone willing, someone untainted by the knowing bred from maturity. But, God, we didn't have a child. Not yet. We'd been trying, but the miscarriages had driven Sarah to the brink. The entity seemed to feel my defiance morph into horror, its presence swelling to fill my vision until I felt my mind tipping over some abyss. And then, in a blink, it was gone. The trees standing solemnly as though nothing had ever interrupted their vigil. Heart pounding, doubts churned my sanity to dust as I raced inside, finding Sarah miraculously undisturbed by my terror. I stole a glance back through the window to the forest, where any trace of my haunting was gone. There were no silhouettes, no glowing stares, just the untouched powder of a January morning. Yet, something subtle but intangible had shifted. With each sunrise that followed, I became acutely aware of how our land felt oddly hollow, a place void of the natural sounds of the world, as if biding its time. I did what any reasonable person would. The incident was locked in the safe confines of my memory, where gusts of snow and shadows couldn't reach. But when night hushed the world beneath a cloak of darkness, the whispers returned, seeping through the cracks in my facade with sinister promises. A willing vessel, they prodded, until sleep became elusive, an enemy affording me no reprieve. Sarah began to notice my habits change, my frantic nature sharp in the clueless kind of way that picks at one's patience. I confessed about that day only partially, dismissing my paranoia with the weather and isolation. Nonetheless, anxiety pried at me, festering into an obsession each time fresh snow hinted at idle footprints. I hoped our home wasn't the anchor for whatever followed us, that if we left, we could escape. Yet, deep down, I feared it was within us, within me. The essence of what fogged my dreams seemed woven into the same veil separating sanity and consciousness. With every whispered reminder, I questioned if it was truly my choice to resist or succumb and bring forth the nameless threat into waking life, donning a mundane coat under daylight's scrutiny. The strange shapes were part of life now, familiar guests in an unwelcome abode. And the terrifying truth was gradually sinking in, the darkness didn't care if I thought myself an asshole for what I'd done, for we'd never again stand unobserved. But would anyone believe me if I said that it all arose from a morning where all I wanted was to clear some snow? It started like any other dreary Thursday evening, my head pounding after churning through yet another soul-crushing day at the office. The flickering streetlights cast eerie shadows, elongating the figures of the sullen commuters, each lost in their world of monotony. I usually zone out on my way home, my thoughts dulled by the daily grind, but that evening, an unsettling feeling clawed at my consciousness. As I trudged past a particularly ominous alleyway, a soft yet frantic whimper caught my attention. My heartbeat quickened, my instincts screaming for me to ignore it and continue walking. But against my better judgment, I stopped, a magnetic force drawing me in. Peering into the dimly lit gloom, I could barely make out a figure hunched over, their outline trembling in the chill of the night. Swallowing hard, I felt an inexplicable urge to step closer, as if some otherworldly presence was compelling me to intervene. The air was thick with tension, each breath like inhaling the remnants of a nightmare. As I approached, the figure turned slightly, revealing a woman's face streaked with tears and desperation. Instinctively, I crouched down, offering unspoken reassurance because, in that moment, words felt futile. Her eyes, large and pleading, spoke of horrors unsaid, and when she finally choked out the words, it was like a veil lifting, revealing a reality harsher than I could have imagined. Between ragged gasps, she told me about a man, the kind of monster hidden in plain sight, who had promised her salvation but delivered her into a waking hell instead. My mind raced, a fierce internal battle as the beer and Netflix night I had envisioned slipped further from grasp. I tried not to glance nervously over my shoulder, telling myself that he couldn't possibly be close, that this scenario couldn't be as dire as it seemed. Clenching my fists to steady my nerves, I helped her up, her skin shockingly cold against mine. As we moved out of the shadows, I strained my ears for any signs of pursuit, the new silence somehow more oppressive than the noise of the city around us. In hushed tones, I learned that she had been captive for the past week, taken from her normal life to serve someone else's dark intentions. I shook my head in disbelief, my brain struggling to catch up with the situation, desperate to wake from this nightmare. We made our way hastily toward my small apartment, each step gaining speed, driven by the urgency of newfound purpose. She clung to me as if I were a lifeline, the night encroaching upon us with every fearful glance I cast into the abyss of the alley. By the time we reached my building, I realized the absurdity of what I'd done, inviting a stranger into my home, no clear plan or thought about what came next. But there was no turning back, an insidious part of me had already decided that this was right. She flinched at the scrape of the elevator doors closing, a reflex honed by the horror she'd endured. Inside my humble, cluttered living room, I offered her a cup of tea with hands that trembled, trying to mask my growing panic under a veil of concerned authority. The shift in setting brought a brief, illusionary calm. Here, amidst the familiar scent of my morning coffee and clutter of my uninspired life, she seemed to shed some of the fear, though shadows still lingered in her eyes. She spoke sparingly now, as if fearful that putting experiences into words might solidify their horror. Her words sketched an image of a world parallel to mine, one where people become pawns and survival isn't guaranteed. I listened, spellbound by the sheer force of her survival instincts, my mind barely able to grasp the full extent of her endurance. We talked through the night, my questions tentative, afraid of triggering more pain yet eager to understand. It dawned on me that beyond horror films and urban legends, evil truly exists in our world, lurking in corners we often overlook. At first light, the realization slammed into me that decisions must be made. I had to act, Really act, not just react, to bring someone truly responsible into this unfolding nightmare. I contacted the police, battling the fear of what her captors might do if they sensed she was no longer under their thumb. In the ensuing hours, a flurry of uniformed officers and sincere promises appeared, the gravity of the situation sinking slowly yet deeply into their practiced professionalism. Throughout it all, she remained by my side, clutching onto the solidity of someone who listened, who believed her when others would question. My once mundane world swirled with chaos, and by the end of it all, she was whisked away to a place of safety. As I watched her leave, something intrinsic within me shifted. I'd played a part in saving a life, yet an emptiness seeped in. Here I was, the unlikely hero in a story that seemed far-fetched even as I narrated in my head. The sheer surrealness of it all, how my ordinary yet comfortable life intersected with the edge of human darkness, was what struck me most. No friends to tell, no family expectant of my call, my account holds lesser weight than those photos that accompany a news headline, snippets of a stranger's unfolding tragedy. I've thought to write her story here, half temptation, half warning, urging those like you to heed cries in the darkness overlooked. Yet speaking aloud feels like betraying a sacred trust, the anonymity her tormentor relished, now undone, a quiet insurrection of a simple life intersected by fate's gnarled hand. So now I sit here, words pouring into ether, into you, reader, confessing not just to the audience, but perhaps to the universe. I hold pieces of another's survival, echoing truths that still haunt the recesses of my nights, casting shadows too vast for my single, inscrutable soul to anywhere else to ever share.